So we continue with chapter 4, Louder Than Words. That's the book. And we're into chapter 4, a couple of pages into the chapter. Over the top, we started with Sylvester Stallone. I will offer a summary before we end this recording. The give and take of motor simulation. The simplest way to test whether language about actions engages the parts of the brain responsible for performing those same actions is to have people perform those two tasks at once and see if they interact. The line of reasoning here is basically the same one that motivated the experiments on visual imagery of shape and orientation we saw in the last chapter. If you have someone read or listen to a sentence that describes a motor action of a particular type, say someone moving their hands away from their body, and then have them perform either the very same action or an incompatible one, like moving their hand toward their body, then they should be faster to perform the compatible action than the incompatible one. An illustration is probably in order here. Well, I'd say, suppose you are at a computer with 3 buttons laid out in front of you. What you're supposed to do is to push and hold down the gray button with your dominant hand, which will make a sentence appear on the screen. As long as you hold down the gray button, the sentence will stay there. You read the sentence and then decide whether it makes sense or not. If it does, you use your same hand to push the black button, and if not, push the white button. The critical point is that you have to move your arm away from your body in order to push the black button, but toward your body for the white one. So your response requires motion in a particular direction, which of course involves a particular set of muscles and which are driven by a particular set of neurons in your motor cortex. Now, the interesting design feature of this experiment is that some of the sentences that pop up when you press the gray button describe motion toward the body, and others describe motion away from your body. For instance, you might see a sentence like you handed the puppy to Katie, which were you to perform the described action, would require you to move your hand away from your body. Or you might see a sentence like Katie handed the puppy to you, which describes movement toward the body. Then halfway through the experiment, the locations of the black and white buttons are swapped. So you make responses over the course of the whole experiment that are both compatible and incompatible with sentences about motion away from you and motion toward you. If understanding sentences about actions activates the parts of the brain responsible for performing those actions, then reading a sentence about a particular action should lead you to respond faster when you're performing a compatible action than an incompatible one. For instance, after you read, "You handed a puppy to Katie," you should be relatively fast to release the grey button and push the black button where it's positioned farther away from you. But if you switch the black and white buttons so that the black button is now closer to you, you should be slower to press it in response to "You handed a puppy to Katie." Because moving your hand towards your body is incompatible with the puppy transferring action you're mentally simulating. And the reverse should be true after reading a sentence like, "Katie handed a puppy to you." In this case, you should release the grey button and push the black button faster if it's located close to you, compatible with the action you perform in the sentence. There have now been about a dozen studies in this paradigm called the action-sentence compatibility effect. The original work by Arthur Glenberg and Michael Kashak at the University of Wisconsin show that different sorts of sentences produce an action-sentence compatibility effect. Declarative sentences that describe hand actions, like "You handed Katie a puppy," or imperative ones that tell you to perform hand actions like "Grab your nose." Figure 17 shows that the results look like when the black button is placed near the participant. Responses are faster to sentences describe motion toward you than sentences describe a motion away from you, and vice versa when the black button is placed in the position farther away from the participant. Studies like this have been influential because they seem to show that people understand language about actions using embodied simulation of those same actions. But there is a concern that has been raised with their design. Namely, it might not be the direction of your motion. To press a button per se, that's compatible or incompatible with the sentence, but rather the location of the button. That is, this might not be an action-sentence compatibility effect, but rather a location-sentence compatibility effect. If this is true, experiments like this don't actually show that people engage mental representations of action while understanding action language. They show that people are engaging mental representations of the location of the things that are described, like the puppy. And we already know from the experiments we saw earlier on clouds and grass that people do mentally represent the locations of things. The researchers who first came up with this methodology responded by performing a new experiment. In this experiment, there was no grey button, just a black one and a white one. Participants held one hand above each of the two response buttons, so that they did actually have to dynamically move their hand toward or away from their bodies to press their buttons. If it was just location that was important, then there should be a compatibility effect in this experiment, just like in the previous one. Sentences about action toward your body should lead you to press a button faster when it's closer to your body, even though your hand was already positioned there. But if it is the action itself, the moving of your hand toward or away from your body, that's the source of the compatibility effect we saw earlier. Then there should be no compatibility effect when the hands are positioned directly above the buttons and no forward or backward action is required. And sure enough, the researchers found no effect when the hands were positioned over the buttons. So we can be fairly confident that it is the direction of action and not merely the ending location that's producing the compatibility effect. But beyond this concern, you might wonder whether these findings really say anything about how people understand language, about action in general. After all the sentences used in this original study were about actions involving you, whether about things you have purportedly done, like you handled Katie the puppy, or things you ought to do, like grab your nose. And in a way, these are the sentences that at first glance, one would think people would be most likely to perform motor simulation to understand. In principle, it seems less likely that we'd engage our motor system to understand sentences that describe other people performing actions. Like Mary put in her earring, or Fred offered the tray of hors d'oeuvre to the guests. So if we're to believe that people use their motor systems to understand language about action in general, then we need to see evidence of an action sentence compatibility effect for language about other people performing actions too. Seem fair? And the short answer is that we do. Experiments conducted in my lab have found that we are faster to move our hand away from our body after reading a sentence about someone else, like Mary or Fred, moving their hand away from their body, faster to move our hand toward our body when the sentence describes someone else moving their hand toward their body. In short, it doesn't appear to matter who is described as performing the action. Language about actions in general results in motor simulation. The Graspasaurus and other magnificent toys. So people simulate performing the actions that they read or hear about. But so far as we only seen this in a gross way, people simulate the direction they would move their hand and arm in. But the motor system encodes fine detail of the movements we know how to perform. Grabbing paper clips versus hammers, for instance, are the motor simulations activated by language this detailed? For instance, think again about the sentences like Mary put in her earring or Fred offered the tray of hors d'oeuvre. To actually perform these actions, you will need to shake your hand in a particular way. You put in an earring by pinching together your thumb and probably your index finger. But when you offer someone a tray, you might be more likely to hold your palms open and facing upwards. When you understand language about these actions, does your motor system simulate the actions all the way down to the last minute in fine detail, like hand shape? We've done some research on this question in my lab. In one study, we had people read sentences describing actions they would perform using either a flat palm, hand shape, Paul carry the watermelon, or a closed fist shape, Sue carry the marble. The participants then had to perform either a compatible or an incompatible action. Logically, just like in the action-sentence compatibility effect, studies described earlier, so in responding to the sentences, participants pressed a large button with either their open palm, compatible with carrying a watermelon, or the closed fist, compatible with carrying a marble. What we found was an action-sentence compatibility effect, where participants were faster to press the button following sentences describing compatible hand shapes. But it turns out that people activate motor simulations of specific hand shapes, even when they're understanding language that doesn't explicitly describe any manual interaction. For instance, think about the sentence like the young scientist looked at the glass. To just look at something, you don't necessarily need to move your hand. So the question is whether understanding a sentence like this leads you to engage your motor system to stimulate grasping of a glass. To find an answer, researchers at the University of Victoria invented a monstrous and unwieldy contraption that looks like something out of the early Paleolithic, the aptly named Grapposaurus. The researchers had participants listen to the sentences about people looking at objects like glasses and staplers. They then cued them to grab one of the attachments on top of the Grapposaurus and measured how long this took. Once again, people responded faster when response hand shapes were compatible with the actions that one would perform to interact with, e.g. grasp the mentioned object. Even though in this case the interaction was not actually described in the sentence. We learn from this part of the way that people understand language about objects is by engaging their motor systems to activate the motor routines that might typically be used with them. The knowledge you have about how to interact with an object is known as the object's affordances. And this research with the Grapposaurus shows that you seem to activate affordances representing what you can do with the glass when you see the known glass. And likewise for belt or grape and dish and so on. Of course, the specific affordances for each object are quite different. They might involve different actions, but these nouns are all describe objects that you can easily imagine interacting with. One way to tell would be by measuring how long it takes people to understand the different types of words. If accessing the meaning for easy to imagine interacting with nouns like grape is easier because the pertinent motor simulation is easier to access, then people should be measurable faster to understand them than hard to imagine interacting with nouns like pond. I think I better, this is so interesting, it's stop at page 85 here in the beginning. Pond, imponderable. Well, this shows a completely new way, and I understand I studied linguistics for an extended time, both linguistics specifically and linguistics in different languages. And I realize now, trying to build a knowledge base was a benign project, or taken from benign ideas, lovable, fantastic project. But since we did not know how it really worked in those days, it has turned out, and I'm shocked by this revelation, that all I learned put me into the wrong direction. There was just unthinkingly used the term intention, and the more I used that, I realize now, the more I tricked my motor neurons of the motor cortex to act in a diffuse, non-consistent way. It was like training your body-mind system not to work so well. I found this book, just looking in the library. It's by Edward Mushery, Doing Without Concepts. And it gave me an idea, because a lot of the concepts that I encountered are not benign, they are malign. Intention is definitely one of those. For each time I understand now, I used intention, I was putting my system down. It doesn't have a correspondent in the motor action, so it will cripple the motor action. It will lead to imbalance in itself. That is, if you believe in it. If you just read the subject without caring, imitating it, not taking it to your heart, and you could still be successful at the test and so forth, you will leave the institution unscathed. But I now realize, as Ian McGilchrist put forward a couple of times, that it is an attitude, and it does cause harm. No concept that is not founded in the motor action of the system will do good things. It will do just the opposite. It will destroy good connections. It will hinder and hamper. They will be exactly like weights on your wrists or over your head. Whereas other concepts, because I don't completely agree with this Edward Mushery, I think he got annoyed by all the empty concepts. Some concepts are valid, and the second side of this thing is that in linguistics they confuse the valid concepts that worked with the invalid, and then bringing even a greater amount of damage, because then I lost my sense for what was a valid concept, what was a working concept, and working is actually 100% working. It's a little bit like teaching someone a language where the words are made up at an instant. They are picked out of the hat like a magician picks cards out of the hat, completely out of the blue. And the more of those things you get, the more likely it is that your motor action system will work to a beneficial degree. You will actually cause yourself harm. And I remember the attitude in the institution was gruesome, it was harsh. And I realized it was probably caused by this. The knowledge you had as starting in linguistics, because of the findings we now have, was bound to be less after you finish your education. And you will have turned your motor action system into a non-working system, or rather, to be more specific, into a system that will work less. It would have been unhealthy. It would make you, like in McKilkris, it would make you a stranger to reality itself. You will feel like, oh, I'm just a guest in this world. I have nothing to do with reality. And every time you think that, because you see now, thinking has consequences. Thinking out of the blue is still consequences. It has to be translated to what it does, because every thought counts. And what it does is harmful in varying degrees. But I would say the word intention is probably the most harmful of all. Of course, dear old Saussure was also a victim of intention, and to think about these things clearly in a knowledgeable way, it is almost impossible. Even if when I read this book, I'm perpetually shocked by the revelation, and especially strong, of course, was the argument that why would evolution ever do this process twice? After language was developed, somehow the meanings should come on top of the rest of what evolution done, on top of the senses, seeing, hearing, sensing, feeling, smelling, the lot. How we move should be somehow not connected to the meaning of words, as intention is suggesting. Intention is truly poisonous, a venomous term. And every time I use that, I enforced another term. You see, they come in blocks: extension. And although extension by itself could have a healthy meaning, could mean the thing I mean out in the world to end confusion, this coupling with the two words make this one drag down under the surface and makes this malign as well. You can see all the words in linguistics drag themselves and the others together, and in an interlocked Saussurian mechanical spectacle, and machinery of torture, of torturing the intellect in an unintended, unconscious way. Because the revelation of this, we couldn't be aware of this until the fMRI. I don't understand how that could happen. It wouldn't be possible. And oddly enough, there were some proponents of this. I would say the late Wittgenstein does have that. But hey, the clues in philosophical investigations and his other later books, it's not sufficient. To go from that, what he wrote, to an understanding that is taken by Benjamin K. Bergen, Georgi Buzaki, Barbara Tversky, it could never ever happen. It is just a few words, and to think that those few words could lead anybody to the right direction, it's very unpedagogical. It could be that Wittgenstein wrote the book for himself, like a notebook for his mind. But we know that he didn't have any sense of pedagogy, and actually would have been a different project entirely, and needing to take several hundred people into action to develop it with experiments and everything. But it's still interesting. It's very close to the goal. You understand that in the example with the slate and the one making a wall, and the word slate is an action in a very, very expanded way, and he seemed to have crossed the borders between inner and outer in the most marvelous way. It is still good, and I think with this new understanding, the deepening understanding from Bujaki, Bergen, Tversky, Barrett Feldman, David Bradle, of course, not to be forgotten, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. This could boost the understanding of Wittgenstein. It is a marvelous treat what he did, though. Without this experiential basis, he came to an understanding that is shockingly close to what we now know, that there is no thinking without motor action. And to have a whole project which is almost based on the misunderstanding of reality will be like teaching a language which just take out the words out of a hat. Teach that to young children, they will not form anything comprehensible, and possibly their development intellectually, language-like, and development will be hampered. It will be stopped almost. To make a nice parallel here, it's similar to how children of Danish parents are stalled in their linguistic development. Sorry for the shock. They blow up things here under the ground, and it's a bit shocking at times. They are 6 months behind most of the population of the world because it's so hard for them to hear what the teachers or parents are saying to them. It has gone in the direction that it's just a blur. So they cannot make heads or tails of what the parents are saying to them, and therefore they get blocked for a while. But not for years, and they get over this blockage pretty soon. But it's, I think it was 6 months to a year. This could block you for the rest of your life. You get stuck in it, and I had a friend, I think he completely got stuck in the idea of intention extension, the idea of syntax as being something like a computer-like outside perspective. And this outside perspective did form his life. His body did no longer work in the same lenient way. This goes to show if you don't show your words to work in your motor action system, you will do bodily harm, and he did so. And he started looking for things that doesn't exist anywhere, not even in computer language. What he thought subjectively, emotionally to be a perfect language, where he decided, unbeknownst to himself, whether the grammar was correct or not. And he chose one of the most gruesome grammatical languages of the world, Turkish, which everything is inflected. I think they had like 200,000 different ways of inflecting a word, verb. He ended up shouting at the institution where they spoke Turkish that they didn't understand their own language. This is a crazy example that shows that we abandon the real world by getting into these things. Some concepts, I don't agree with the Missouri guy, but some concepts can be absolutely detrimental to you and your health because they are unthought of. They don't have a good quality to them of working in the world. And it could be, I'm now just hypothesizing, this is what the ancient Greeks did with the invention of the psyche in contrast to the soma. And that this is similar to the soma and the psyche, the body-mind. It's a way that doesn't actually depict something that we could do. It's saying like the carpenter nailed glass to the floor by using a hammer. It's a bit like that. Psyche, soma has this relationship. It's not an ideology for the first. It is not something that you actually can believe in. It is not something you can embody. And that is the problem. The problem is not the idea that, which I object to now, that Descartes created dualism. It was present in his system. And what he called dualism and what we call dualism is just his randomized thoughts. There is nothing to dualism. It cannot be put into a book and criticized, like many people done. Because just like intention extension, they are not properly working words. They are still doing something in a system, let's call it linguistics or philosophy, but they don't have a good grounding in the motor cortex, and therefore they don't do their job. Like a hammer with the handle is broken, or I think more aptly put, a hammer where the hammering thing, the metal part, is made of wood. I think this is more apt, wood or plastic. How could you nail something with a hammer where the head is made of plastic? It's not heavy enough, it's not hard enough. It's bound to make you really angry. And I would say if you went too far in this, you lose your body thinking connection. You lose both body and soul at the very same time. Talk about causing harm. It is most deceitful, but it was never intended ever. It just happened.